So anyways, we got three chapters to talk about today. We got Ben Franklin's American Breed. This was where I thought it started. I guess I didn't dislike it, but I started to feel a little bit differently about kind of how she approached some of the characters, especially, Thomas Paine. I have a lot of affection, I guess that may be part of the issue. Um, so what do we think about Ben Franklin's American Breed?
Well, I think that this book puts a lot of historical characters in a different perspective than I've certainly had in my head about them.
Yeah.
Um, the thing that comes through to me so far in the book, and I mean so far being chapter 8 or 9 that I'm reading currently,
hmm
is that there was a huge amount of snobbishness in our history, and I suppose even today. In spite of all the talk about being created equal, etc., there was a great deal of inequality then,
Yeah.
perhaps then even more than there is now. Um, and so it's a rather bleak look at the history of the United States and the people in it, where a large portion of them were disparaged and relegated to the role of being less than animals almost.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I think there was and she doesn't, although she's clearly offended by that, right? And she's kind of pointing that out from that perspective. Um, I think even she doesn't appreciate quite the kind of the widespread nature and the fact that that some of these people did leave records and kind of did leave a trace. There's Mark again. Hey, Mark. They do mention in Western, the whole Shays Rebellion thing, I think in the context of Jefferson, right? How he reacted to it, which was kind of an interesting perspective, because I've always sort of been much more focused on how Washington um, responded to Shays Rebellion, because Washington got what's his name, General Lincoln, who led the troops, who were mostly kind of volunteer vigilantes. They weren't really a official militia that went out to try to put down the rebellion in Western Massachusetts. Um, these generals that had previously worked for Washington during the Revolutionary War were writing him these alarmed letters about how the social order was being turned completely upside down, and it was going to be anarchy, and it's the end of whatever we were fighting for and all of that. And that does kind of pull Washington back to the convention that becomes the Constitutional Convention. And there's a lot of evidence that that it's his um, kind of feeling of alarm over this that precipitates his participation. But the idea that Jefferson was had thoughts about this as well was kind of interesting, because I always sort of think of Jefferson as being, I mean, almost the way they portray him in the musical Hamilton, right? Like he's away in France, he's partying it up, and and hanging out with his aristocratic buddies, and then he kind of and Sally Hemings apparently, um, and then he comes back and starts to opine on some of these issues. But the guys who did, she briefly mentions the guys who um, still had a beef after Shays Rebellion, and refused to support the Constitution when it was sent around to Massachusetts for ratification, um, and certainly didn't like the 1780 John Adams Massachusetts Constitution, um, which was much less liberal than the U.S. Constitution turned out to be. Um, I mean, I have sort of studied those people. Those are people that I've been kind of trying to track down from Western Mass. The guy that sold the property in Ashfield to the people who I studied extensively was a member of the Allen family. And he was a cousin of Ethan Allen, and he refused to sign the loyalty oath after fighting against, after being a rebel in Shays' Rebellion, refused to sign the loyalty oath, went to Vermont, which was not part of America at the time, and and settled a village or a town on an island in Lake Champlain on one of the, I think, South Hero Island, and they called them the Hero Islands after the Allens. Um, so there's a whole tradition surrounding these people. So they're not as easy in some cases to write off or to kind of pretend there isn't a story about them as she's making. Another thing that I just got from her was this: The Problem with Democracy, which she co-wrote with somebody else. Oh, thumbs down on that. She co-wrote with somebody named Andrew Burstein, who wrote about Andrew Jackson, and he also teaches in Louisiana at the university that she's at. And this is about the two Adams presidents, John and John Quincy, and they confront the cult of personality, by which I assume they mean Andrew Jackson. So that'll be interesting because I think it kind of follows on this.
What year was that book? Earlier, I presume, than
This one, I
2016?
think this is just very recent. I think this is
Okay.
just come out, 2019. Yeah, so
Okay.
a
Because
little bit.
what I find kind of interesting is, particularly in the chapter 5 piece relating to that, she wrote this book in 2016, really before the rise of Trump. So, and my guess is she probably lost the copy in 2015, and then it came out in 2016.
Yeah.
Um, but there's a lot of interesting little tidbits in the Andrew Jackson description that mirror a lot of the Trump piece,
Mhm.
um, that subsequently came after.
You just broke up a little bit. I didn't get all that.
And and in some sense too, it's the, oh, and it's, some of his rise to power kind of mirrors that same thing. And she gives it a throwaway line at the tail end of the chapter that he wasn't gaining the votes of the lowest of the low, who he presumably was representing, but he was picking up votes from the kind of the low class who had some land but wanted more, and picked those up, and that presumably is what carried him across the line. Versus now, Trump is actually pandering to the identities of the lowest of those low to try and pick himself up, but he's got a much larger electorate to play with.
Yeah. And so overall, what does that mean about the way she approaches Jackson?
I think one of the interesting issues is how much these characters are um, play acting or something of that nature to make themselves appeal to um, a group that they want their support of. And it's interesting for a non-historian or someone who has very little exposure to history like myself to read these accounts of Jackson and Davy Crockett and whoever. It's quite a shock, and it's the author's approach is, I don't know how else to describe it, than very one-sided, and I'm what my reaction, one of the reactions was, well, do historians see what she's saying as completely authentic, or is she picking and choosing her stories and her language to, I don't know, to present a particular image she wants to present?
Yeah, I think the latter probably. That was kind of the sense that I got, and that's why I sort of said last week that that this is that I was sort of unreservedly appreciative of the first the intro and the first couple of chapters, and then this is where I start getting a little bit um, less happy
Well, I
because
mean,
she does
your your
character.
background your background must have um, provided at least some insights into this stuff was real, but how, I mean, you can always, how much of it is posturing and how much of it is, there's a little bit of an examination of that, but
Mhm.
still, that's what I was curious about from someone who has studied these individuals more intensely.
Yeah. And I think that they are I think it is I think it's kind of my sense of it was that it was sort of cherry picking. It wasn't that she was making things up or misrepresenting elements of Jackson's story or someone else or Davy Crockett or anyone, but that it was, that it was a piece of the story, and there are plenty. I mean, it's almost more common nowadays to see a historical presentation like that. I mean, um, even people who, and these are all bestsellers, right? And so, so people don't. Apparently, there's a different kind of standard um, of truth for these. I mean, and even when like Heather Cox Richardson will write a bestseller, um, it's not. I mean, it seems to me it seems like it's about sort of curating a set of facts from the the slip box, right? That kind of supports a a character you want to build out of these people. I think that there's a lot of I mean, I think it's very possible to portray Jackson as a boastful, kind of uncouth, uh, guy from Nashville who has this, he has this really, very, very kind of raw spot, for, with the about the way that his wife is treated and her, her previous marriage situation and all of that, and the legitimacy of her as first lady. Apparently, and there's two ways that you can take that, right? That you can take that as as evidence of some kind of psychological issue, or that he's other people have portrayed that as as very chivalrous and positive. Go ahead, Tim.
But also contrasting, just like you said, what you particularly said last week, and a bit like Mark was saying, it struck me that who were we talking about last week? Who were we talking about this week? Last week we were talking about mostly Brits of one flavour or another.
Mm.
Although some of those Brits had an input into Constitution, Bill of Rights, all that type of stuff in the Revolution, none of them were really as essential as the three primary people of the stroke, Washington and so forth. So it dawned on me that there's a bit more preciousness about people we're talking about. And we collectively, we all know certain things about those heroes of the revolution, right or wrong, biased or not. And if that preconceived set is not matched, then we'll imply that there's a bias in what we're reading. And it's a bit like, for crazy reasons, I've been catching up on your recent Substack. So there's a comment for me, for instance, about linkages and actual connections. Now, we haven't mentioned that in the terms of these 3 chapters, and which one of us is one of the original Pilgrim Fathers, like whatever,
Mm.
on a similar quirk. I mean, I've never really read anything into John Locke, coincidentally. But partly because it's come up in this philosophy, and partly because he's a bit more peripheral than many characters are in, say, Stevenson's Baroque series. And partly because I said about Leeds of Jardine last week, I sort of picked him up again. And I suddenly realised, in literally just looking at a quick summary of him, that a friend of mine's ancestor effectively paid for Locke's education.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, why did I not know that? Okay, there's lots of things you don't know, but but it's like all of a sudden it becomes a lot more tangible, such that none of us really poo-pooed Locke last week, and I'd probably slightly take offence if we suddenly did poo-poo him. But it's like, why? Why? Because John and I chatted on the train 10 years ago. It's like, so what? Like, but it's all of a sudden it's a direct connection, or at least a very less than an abstract one.
I've never been a fan of Locke because of the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. But who is actually somebody that popped up onto my radar this week that I'm gonna pursue a little bit is William Godwin, because I think that he is an interesting character between Paine and people later in the English sort of free thought and radical traditions. But that's beside the point. One of the things that did strike me though was this, when she talks, there were things that she sort of leaves out as she's talking about things. She talks about Pittsburgh, and she talks about, sort of this caravan of lubbers, and kind of low quality people who sort of make their way there. But the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, was begun by George Washington, out in that area around Fort Duquesne, land speculating, surveying in order to speculate on land, right, beyond the the area that they were supposed to be, right? So they were way out of bounds, right? They were on territory that was clearly at that point in 1756 part of New France, right? Because New France extended from what's now Canada to to the southern Mississippi, right? So they really had that entire western corridor kind of tied up.
So surveyors and map makers were somewhat deliberately lost so they could find more out.
Well, they knew they weren't supposed to be out there, right? And they were out there surveying, for the purpose of land speculation, because the crown had sort of given them the go ahead, right? But they, they knew that they were, that they were sort of trespassing on French territory, and so it was all sort of a, kind of a nod and a wink, kind of a way of pushing that frontier, forward. But so it's not all about the the nasty, toothless, unwashed, uh, squatters all sleeping in the same bed, living in a thatched hut. Um, it, and and similarly, yeah, right. And it's no surprise at all, right, that this guy, and the most wealthy man in America at the time. Um, Although he had competition, but he probably was. And also, to go back to what she was saying in the earlier chapters, right? He got that way by way of marrying a widow. So so there's a whole
Oh,
lot of that story sort of continues into this period. The part about Thomas Paine, who I have studied quite a bit, although there's more for me to read on him too. The idea that he somehow wasn't legitimate, right? That common sense wasn't as big a pamphlet as he claimed it was, and that he somehow claimed that it had sold 100,000. Um, Paine didn't make any such claims. Paine gave the pamphlet to the revolutionary cause when he could have sold it. And it was basically, um, it kind of in the public domain, and so everybody reprinted it. And the I think fairly authoritative, and plausible, accounts that I've read suggest that a couple 100,000 copies were published, and it was not only read by, they were not only read by probably more than one person each, but they were also read aloud in taverns and in public meetings and things like that. So it really, I don't know where, I don't know what her point even really is in suggesting that it wasn't the most influential pamphlet in American history, because I think it really kind of clearly was. And so I wonder, so so my point is not only that I have a beef with her about that, but I'm curious about what the motivation is for sort of downplaying that.
yeah. And she did kind of separate him as an outsider too. Like he's way more British, and that kind of struck me as a subtle piece there. Kind of like, oh, why were people listening to this guy who's way over there? Why were they listening to John Locke? Really,
Hmm. Yeah.
that's kind of a moot.
Well,
Um,
he was kind of a citizen of the world, right? He did go back to London. He was in London, when Burke wrote, and he responded to Burke, with the rights of man. And then that was, and then he fled to France, to Calais, and he was, convicted in absentia of seditious libel. But then, as soon as he arrives at Calais, they declare him a citizen of revolutionary France, right? And the people of Calais elect him to the Congress, or their assembly, or whatever it is, whatever it's called, on their behalf. So he becomes a political figure in revolutionary France as well, and up until the point where he offends the Jacobins by saying that they really shouldn't kill the king and queen.
well, I mean, wasn't he famously the man without a country? You know,
Yeah, he kind of was, because and then he gets incredibly offended, and he has this real beef with Washington for not kind of going to bat for him while he's in the French prison, slated for execution. It's not. I mean, I think it's ultimately it's Monroe who gets him out, but for quite a while he is very uh, he's very antagonistic towards, and he actually writes some very derogatory things about. He gets very spiteful, and he writes some things. He writes some nasty things about Washington, being, not as bright as everybody would like to believe he is, and things like that.
One of the things I would take issue with her on this, and maybe it's more to the early chapters too, but she and in some sense maybe she's giving us something to grab onto with the older history, because the average American is only going to know Jefferson, Washington, Adams, and that gang, or Franklin. But a lot of this, she's framing literally to the heads of chapter titles, all of these stories to the Franklins and the Jeffersons and the Andrew Jacksons. And most people really aren't even as well versed with Andrew Jackson as they are with others.
Mm-hmm.
But that seems to be the overarching story, is what these rich, powerful people thought of the lower classes versus telling the story of the lower classes more directly. And it's harder to create that story through line and do that research to find those lower classes who either wrote a lot themselves or were written about to be able to form that.
Mm-hmm.
But that kind of perspective is, to me, a little odd. And even to the point, I think it was on page 106, she talks about the lower classes and kind of a dichotomy of, oh, they're the common man, but then, and not well educated, but then on the other side they quickly can shift to becoming I think she used the phrase, dirk wielding or dirk bearing, like, killer. And so she narrows it down to this: it's either one or the other for this identity, rather than what assuredly is a much broader, Gaussian curve of people and types. And she's kind of subjecting them to an all or nothing perspective, rather than, hey, there's a range of people, and most of them may have fit into the center as the kind of separate, simple, uneducated, we're trying to get by. I mean, I threw in a video that the USDA made in I think it was 1962, into the chat earlier in the week.
Mm.
It talks about the government and people in power. So this is administration talking about the dirt poor in Appalachia and smaller places in the country, and how painfully poor a lot of people are. And this is in an era where we're still electrifying the country, so people are spending hundreds of hours carrying wash back and forth just to wash their clothes. But that's your day. Do a load of laundry, and that's 8 to 10 hours of solid work, carrying water back and forth, physically, manually scrubbing your clothes, hanging them up, drying them. You get your 10,000 steps doing that real quick.
Yeah.
we forget how backbreaking that work was. But it's those little things, I think, that are missing from some of this narrative, is that kind of color. And she may not have access to it, and broadly as a popular press book, or I view this as a more popular press than an academic. I mean, certainly it's footnoted and written by an academic, but it's a secondary source looking back at primary sources, and either those primary sources don't exist, or she chose not to include them in this piece of the narrative.
Well, I think she does jump over a lot of material, right? I mean, she talks briefly kind of about this difference between country life and city life, but we don't really get descriptions of what country life is like and what city life is like. And there are plenty of them, right? Because there's not only, Crevecoeur writing the letters of the American farmer, right? But there's de Tocqueville in this era. There's, there are a bunch of people writing about, I mean, there's, what's her name? The lady who goes to Cincinnati and writes about how squalid she finds Cincinnati. Trollope, Mrs. Trollope, and so there are a lot of sources about city life back on the East Coast, city life in these new cities, country life. Um, she also never really talks about the War of 1812, which I kind of in Alan Taylor's camp, and I think that is sort of not it's either a second American Revolution or it's a first American Civil War, and a big and there's a big regional and there's a big class and urban rural element, and dimension to this. There's an invasion of Canada. Why do we invade Canada? Who wants to invade Canada? You know, um, and then I mean, how do you really talk about Jackson without really spending some time on 1830 and Indian removal, right? There's this whole world of the Cherokee and the Creek and the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and the Seminole, right, who live in this area to the west of Georgia and Alabama, right, that are a barrier to westward expansion of, plantation culture, right, and that economy, right, to a small extent, they sort of hopscotch over them and they begin doing it in, sort of northwestern Florida and what becomes Mississippi. But although, the Cherokee especially had almost completely assimilated. Right? And Jefferson, and this kind of goes back to Jefferson too, right? Jefferson had said, she goes on and on about notes on the state of Virginia. He had sort of advised them to become Americans, and they had. Right? They had a bicameral legislature. They had a court system that looked like ours. They had a bilingual newspaper, right? They had slave plantations. It was the whole package, right? And so who is it that is behind this move to remove them? And Jackson certainly supports this. A lot of historians think that he's behind. He's kind of one of the people who's behind this move to legislate their removal. And then the Supreme Court, of course, rules against it in Worcester v. Georgia. And he says, well, the court has ruled, now let them go enforce it.
But from the outside, Jackson is the genocidal president. The other thing is, going back to her style of writing and the fact that some of these paragraphs don't have an endnote and/or don't have two or more endnotes because there's two or more things.
Mm-hmm.
There are so far on part, I haven't quite finished 5 on close. So far, I can't recall seeing any paragraph with more than one reference, footnote, endnote, whatever you want to call it. So I think the fact that we've praised her for such an extensive in the first 2 chapters of the intro, I mean, she's clocked, or she's made a decision that for almost every paragraph, she'll put some notes, but she'll never put 2, because she so far doesn't seem to put 2 per paragraph. So, and there's at least 50% of all the paragraphs got something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of them she does. I mean, like note 66 goes on and on and on and has she cites all kinds of sources. So I think it
So this, but that's without looking at the actual note. All I'm saying is there's only one number reference on
oh,
each
okay.
chapter. Whether that then goes to three or four things is is somewhat irrelevant as opposed to how you would expect it to be if a paragraph was referenced to one, two, or three. You'd expect to see one, two, or three reference numbers normally.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, they she
So she
in a more
seems,
scholarly work, there would probably be a note, an end note number after every sentence, right? And in this
well,
case,
well,
she sort of combines them all at the end of the
I,
paragraph.
I, I would, I would expect to see if it's pertinent to the chapter of, sorry, the paragraph, then the paragraph has three numbers after it. If there are three threes being used, I wouldn't hold it per sentence because that starts to make it difficult to read. But a couple of two or three blue numbers or whatever at the end of a paragraph is fine. Um, but it's, and several of the books we've already read have, I don't think any of them have decided that there would be one reference tag regardless of what there is in the notes. And I I was thinking before we started, just as I was finishing off what I was doing in chapter 5, was I really need more screen size so that I can actually have notes, text, and her notes,
Hmm.
and then on a second screen, whatever else I want to dip into that she's made reference to. Um, and as I say, I still have shut my eyes to that. I'm reading the text.
Hmm.
I dare not, because I'll just go down a rabbit hole.
Right.
Otherwise, too much.
I'm I
So
I'm more comfortable with that idea that it's that I mean I'm not criticizing her for combining everything in one reference number at the end of each paragraph. I mean, I kind of did that in my own, my biography of Knowlton. I had these discursive notes that kind of added, peripheral or tangential things to the story. I mean, sometimes that's almost. I mean, there are different traditions around that in the same way as, indexing that we read about last time, right? That can be kind of just a game in some cases too.
You need the footnotes as a place to dump the extra index cards that you don't know what to do with in the main story, you know.
And oftentimes, I've enjoyed, finding things in notes in books that I've never, that I really wasn't that interested in the actual narrative or argument of the thing. I mean, that was when we were talking about, how to read a book. That was one of my, one of my issues with that was that I wasn't as interested in that whole, kneel at the feet of the master and and imbibe everything that he doles out to you. I was more like I'm going in here on a mission to find things that interest me, and they may be in the guy's narrative or argument, or they might not be. They might be just things and ideally maybe even would be the things that the guy, or the author, he or she didn't find as interesting that I find it, that I find valuable and I can, put together into something of my own. Um,
Oh, going back a minute, you asked the question of why did they remove the Cherokee from North Georgia? Now, I'll give you a thesis that I've never read before, but I think even stringing it together lightly puts a fine point on it. So in 1829, the beginning of the first gold rush in America happens in Dahlonega, Georgia, in in the northeast mountains, the foothill, literally the foothills of the Appalachians, because the Appalachian Trail starts
yep.
10 miles outside of that town.
Mhm.
Um, John C. Calhoun owns one of the largest gold mines that exists there or existed at the time there. And it's a half an hour drive now by car, maybe 45 minutes to get from there to the capital of the Cherokee Nation in what is now New Echota.
Hmm.
So they're driven out, but that town where the Cherokee capital sits is now known as Calhoun, Georgia,
Hmm.
named after John C.
Yeah.
So I think here's a guy who's landed gentry power who across the border from South Carolina has a massive gold mine that's surrounded by Indians. Can't have that. Let's get it out. Let's get them out. So literally minutes after that gold rush starts, the Trail of Tears is on its way.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that is, and you have to, you have to assume that they're not aware that it is not going to be a huge thing in the way that, California or Pikes Peak later was, right? That gold is found and maybe, this whole area is swimming with it, and most of it is occupied by these tribes who have really done a good job of turning themselves into Americans. And yet, yeah, and so we
Yeah, I think
have
it
to.
was about roughly 15,000 people moved to that tiny little, and it's even today, there's a one reasonable sized highway that goes through the town that brings some business, but that town even today is still a fly speck on the map.
Mhm.
And really, in large part, exists because there's a military college in the town,
Hmm.
and the entirety of the town really revolves around that college. But otherwise, a
Yeah,
very small,
yeah,
probably 3,000 to 4,000 people there.
yeah, yeah. No, I think you're right about that, Chris. I think another of the things that she doesn't mention is, this idea that with transportation, communication being as difficult as it was prior to steam power, right? It was one of the biggest, oh, there goes the thumbs up again. This AI. One of the biggest concerns that they had throughout this period was that, and it's reflected again and again in my primary sources that I use with my students, that the people on the frontier are going to lose their Americanness. They're going to be, less connected to, the centers of power, the centers of government back on in the the coastal, you know, mid-Atlantic region. And they're going to be more accessible to the French or the Spaniards or, or even the British, right? And thus, that the people who move out to this frontier are going, so it's not at all the sentiment that Frederick Jackson Turner will ultimately articulate, right? That you go to the frontier and it washes away all of the European vestiges of your character, and it remakes you as an American, right? And that's the whole, that's the whole value of the frontier and all of that. That's not the way they understand it at the time. What they understand at the time is that people are going to go so far away and have so little access to the home culture that they will become foreigners, right? And I think that would have been valuable for her to deal with, right? This question of, well, what about, these people who are not going, who are no longer going to be Americans, right? That certainly would impact how people back, in the centers of power would feel about them.
So, Kevin Costner was taking a real risk when he went out to dance with wolves. Um,
That's a post Civil War thing, though. So
yeah, I know.
that's way west.
What? Yeah, but also one assumes that you guys are still on your slow but persistent evolution of sort of social thinking. So it probably still happened. And then, of course, the other thing is, all of a sudden, I now know about 1846 laws in Arizona because of certain recent events. And so far, that process of you've already mentioned that Vermont wasn't parcel of the first step US, right? That has similarities to here, because on the 53 odd years ago, when the British decided they couldn't afford to hold all the defence for here, all of the Emirates became effectively independent on one morning, and then they all formed what we think of as UAE, except Bahrain and Qatar decided they would stay on their own because they're not continuous. It's, that's a bit more like Hawaii and Alaska. In fact, that's exactly because Qatar is attached to the continent and Bahrain is just an island. So that works quite well. But Ras Al Khaimah, which is the bulk of the northern bit right up by the Straits of Hormuz and the little horn bit where all the boats have to go around, it took them 6 months to move over. They stayed on their own for a bit. And we had a shooting war, I suppose, which you could almost say mimics a bit of you guys taking on Mexico. It lasted about 20 minutes with about 50 bullets fired, and then it stopped, with Saudi Arabia deciding to have a push, as well as Abu Dhabi pushing against Dubai to see if that would all crumble and it would all just become not the UAE, but Abu Dhabi. And I think that's the bit that's missing to me, because I don't know much about. It wasn't a quick process. Any more than really, if you look back, see how long it took William I and II to finally reach the boundaries of England and finish the general move work there. And the other way off being thing that struck over this was also talking about in a number of instances there's issues with what are we going to trade, who are we going to trade with, what about trade between the states, who regulates, what regulates, where the taxes, federal taxes, not federal taxes, etc., etc., etc. And of course, there would have been a whole bunch of existing people smuggling crap out of both north, south, east place. And of course, many of those people then turn around and become people traffickers for good reasons and bad reasons, getting slaves in and out, getting slaves out as well as just bringing in, untaxed tea before people dump it in the harbour, and how that echoes through quite a lot of this work, with all the work that was also being spoken about with the trade early days in Dawn of Everything, with how that trade works, what's the cultural changes to the traders accept. But of course, you've now got money, so that touches on the debt. So it was all sort of joining up, coming around, and looking at what else. Now that you've got the commonality, you've got materially one language, one currency, one set of overarching laws. Where's where's all the extra from the benefits? Where's the commentary of the commercial environment being so much better? Because we don't have to involve Brits, we don't have to go back to the king and all this. That doesn't seem to be coming through as well as I would thought it would be.
Hmm. I think it may be,
Maybe that comes. Maybe she picks a hero of that later.
maybe she will, but yeah, along the way, again, I am sort of struck by all these things that she doesn't talk about, right? I mean, a big element of I mean, when she's talking about Franklin, I mean, Franklin's an interesting character. We talked about it a little bit last week, right? He is of all of the founders, the one that most approaches kind of being a self-made man. He does actually work. He has a job and he enriches himself. And so then he's able to retire from his business and become a public figure. Along the way, he also has a lot of interactions that would have been interesting to explore in here, right? The Paxton boys, right? When they it's this infamous scene where they massacre a bunch of peaceful natives, Conestogas, and basically get away with it. And then they actually write this manifesto where they kind of in a way similar to Nathaniel Bacon in Bacon's Rebellion, in 1676. They accuse the powers that be, and in this case, the powers that be are the Penn family in Philadelphia, of preferring the urban, the urban electorate, the urban electors, um, and the urban concerns in the assembly to the frontier ones, to the ones on the frontier. And it's very late that Western Pennsylvania, although Pittsburgh does, kind of build up, but Northwestern Pennsylvania really doesn't for really quite a long time into the 19th century. So there's that episode. Franklin also has a lot of interaction with the Quakers, right? And so that's interesting too, right? So there's this commercial interest that she is seems to be kind of building up to, sort of saying, well, the commercial interest is, sort of this entrenched aristocracy in the cities, and that's not, that's not entirely accurate, right? I mean, the Quakers do not really kind of fit into that. The Quakers are not, um, are not from many of them not from these original sort of founding families of New York or even Pennsylvania, or or New Jersey or Delaware. The other thing that she doesn't, she very briefly mentions Fenimore Cooper, right? And the person that she calls Leatherstocking, whose actual name was Natty Bumppo. And I don't know why she didn't say that. Maybe she thought it was too hokey. But that's the name of the character of Hawkeye in the Leatherstocking tales, like Last of the Mohican. But James Fenimore Cooper is the son of William Cooper, right? Who is like one of the first, probably the first real town maker of upstate New York, right? Where now sits the Baseball Hall of Fame. Uh, and and so that so there's this whole there's another whole story there of this guy who goes out to the William Cooper is this guy who makes this town. He settles, he brings people in, he shares with them to a much greater extent than other land speculators who sell land at huge profits to people who want to settle, and often sell big blocks of land to other people who want to speculate and want to profit from the increase in land values. Cooper does the opposite. Cooper sells small parcels. Cooper sort of subsidizes these new settlers and kind of gives them what they need to make it through their first year and to kind of establish their farms or their small businesses, whatever, if they're craftsmen or something, and is kind of a model of an alternative. I mean, it would seem like if you're interested in this, in doing more than just complaining about, how the elites look down on the lubbers, you would consider talking about some of this stuff.
So, UK-wise, some of the industrial Quaker traditions was to build better quality housing and village come town structures. So are you saying that Fenneman is effectively rolling on that theme, or
Well,
is it?
it's not necessarily industrial. It's not like David Dale and Robert Owen. It's more like, oh, we're gonna have a community, and I'm gonna attract farmer settlers or merchants that, small merchants or grist millers or whatever. Basically all he did was sort of give them enough credit, supply them with food, before they're producing their own, things like that. I do think it's interesting. I do think that what David Dale, I was actually just reading one of Edward Royal's 1998 book about Robert Owen and the coming, and the commencement of the millennium, and Royal gives David Dale a lot of credit for getting, sort of setting up the social um, thing that Robert Owen would later take credit for in New Lanark, the whole kind of socialist ideal. But so I think there's a lot going on in that, in that time. The William Cooper thing would be a little bit, so it would be kind of contemporary with that. Yeah.
Because the other thing with the Quakers, UK wise, they have and it's Dan, I mean, one of them, obviously, they have the problem of being MPs. They won't take an oath. And some of them manage to slip under the radar because they're not rubbing enough people up the wrong way, such that they affirm the same way as they're allowed to affirm in a court case.
Right. Right. Which is
And then, of
really
course,
ironic that they get to do that and then Bradlaugh doesn't. But that's
yeah.
fine.
And then, of course, you get the other odd Quaker who's a bit more of a socialist type person, stridently so, is refused and forced to run a by-elections and all the rest of it, and still win several times over.
Mm.
But it's the things that get spoken about a lot within the village structure, straight the town structure, is because they're very often initially effectively they're a corporate town, they're one company town.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's Quaker, it's like, oh, no bars, no pubs, no churches,
Mm-hmm.
either, because they're Quakers, right? And partly from the engineering side of my work, I don't do housing, or haven't done professionally done houses in much in that way. I've done one project with houses. There's all the beginnings of town planning and all this, and the examples you get from like Bourneville or more importantly, I suppose, Welwyn Garden City, which was a name change to Welwyn Garden City after it started. And coincidentally, my dad left there in his later. Um, it was also a one-shop town,
Hmm.
even though it's big enough to have multiple shops. It was all the same shop, just different branches. And it was in my lifetime that changed. And then the primary shop of all things got taken over by the John Lewis branch, which is in corporate terms is about as a Quaker as you get in terms of it's a cooperative in some respects, um, owned and run for the employees and past employees, etc.
Hmm.
Um, and so Bourneville has the first bar in Bourneville was a licensed bar in the town centre, in the uh, town hall, in effect, as a part of the banqueting facility.
Hmm.
Um, and now there's multiple shops in Welling Garden City. But Welling Garden City, of course, was also like the number two. It was already starting, but it started just after World War One, and come just after World War Two, when we needed more homes, heroes, etc. It got assumed into the government process of new towns.
Hmm.
So that the new town legislation gave corporates or associations that became corporate a bigger say and a mechanism to buy up land and push through construction. So it was number two after Letchworth. And
So how did they deal with this question of the people, of who the people are imagined to kind
well,
of?
obviously, Bourneville originally was just employees,
Mm.
so that was easy.
Mhm.
But and I'm not sure about the mechanism for choosing the owner. Well, the other thing, of course, with Wellingborough City was originally there was a fixed ratio of owner occupier versus rent. Not
Mhm.
sure who controlled rent, but the other thing with Welling is it's still quite an odd place. It's one of the biggest employers at Welling is Rank Zero for copiers. Um, and
Mhm.
down the road from there, Hemel Hempstead, the big employer there was Kodak.
Mhm.
Um, so there's a number of not quite, but almost wonderful towns, as it were,
Yeah,
in terms of major employers.
right.
Um,
One of the things that strikes me about that is that, in um, of course in Newlyn Ark, it's like, 30 miles from anywhere, on the Clyde River, right? Similarly, when David Dale starts that around 1790, right, after meeting with Arkwright and stealing his technology. And then he sells it to his son-in-law, Robert Owen, and then a couple of wealthy dudes from Boston, Francis Cabot Lowell and Nathan Appleton, come and see the technology and see the mill and actually kind of also see the community that David Dale built and that Owen took over. And they go back to Massachusetts and they start a mill on the Charles River in Waltham, and then ultimately they kind of take over the entire Merrimack River from New Hampshire through Nashua and Manchester and Concord down into what becomes Lawrence and Lowell, which are basically just Lowell is just West Chelmsford, is just this farm country, and they basically buy it up. They create a city, and really kind of they basically build it from the ground up, right? And then they recruit all of these mill workers who are farm girls, right? They're the daughters of farmers in the, in that part of New England. And and the thing that strikes me about them is that then they, in less than a generation, this city kind of springs out of the ground like, mushrooms after rain. And and the interests of the people living there almost immediately diverge from the interests and the worldview and the understanding of the world that their extended families that they've left behind retain. Right. So you've got these people on the countryside who have this idea about who they are and where they fit in the world and all of that. And then you've got this new city that has grown up in their midst where people have different, different worldview, different politics, different day-to-day interests, right? There, the mill girls are interested in, in the safety of the mills and the rent at the, in the dormitories and the cost at the company store of the things that they have to, that they have to buy, and the hours that they're working and the work conditions and all of that. So a whole different a completely different raft of things that they're thinking of. And that would be something, and that happens in this period that she's talking about in this chapter too, at the end of chapter 5. She's well into the 1840s, right? And this is all happening in the 1830s, 1840s. And so this, it also, again, seems to me that this would be something, if you're going to talk about how the attitudes of, and how the interests and how the concerns of, a class of people get formed, that would be relevant.
Yeah. To go back a minute to your mention of Benjamin Franklin and what's missing there. She does go out of her way to describe his mode of dress as him reaching into the upper echelon of society. He's got the frill and the ruff and the whole thing. And Isaacson's book, the picture is literally on the cover. Although in my mind, when I thought, it's like, for some reason, I thought this picture was him wearing a coonskin hat.
Right, when he's in France. Yeah.
But he didn't have, it wasn't a coonskin hat. It was a marten fur hat
Okay.
that he got in Canada. But as a class symbol, when he goes to France, he wears it along with American-made shoes, and you know he, and I think even Isaacson gives him describes him as he's trying to, and if some of it's a class structure thing, he's trying to write himself to the King of France and draw it as kind of a backwoods philosopher, I think was the phrase Isaacson
Mm-hmm.
had used.
Mm-hmm.
But it's literally, here's this high class guy who can match the almost the mode of dress, maybe not in Paris so much as he could in London, but he can match the mode of dress, and he has that capability. But he specifically chooses to take a lower class dress to distinguish himself. And I think even in the, I want to say in the Adams
With
TV show, you
with
know,
the other with the other form of
he hits Adams and bothers Adams. He's like, dress different, be different, think different. Like, let's.
Right. He does, she does talk about this kind of how the very wealthy dress down and all of that. And which struck me as kind of weird, because didn't she kind of brushed by sumptuary laws in the early chapters as well, which was a thing that the Puritans did in New England. A thing that she skipped along the way also was homespun, right? And the whole embargo and boycott situation that we had going on in the run up, in the whole decade and everything. Oh, stop. I think UPS must be here. This run up to the to the War of 1812, which again is somehow off her radar. But there was uh, a lot of interest in Americans, in that period of the first decade or so of the 19th century, whether they were wearing, you know, British textiles and European cuts and fashions, or whether they were, wearing American product, oftentimes homespun, oftentimes, actual real domestic manufacture. And then, and then also in this period, one of the biggest things that happens when the Erie Canal is completed is, in the first couple of years as the Erie Canal was opened, it began being opened in 1819. It was begun in 1817, but it was opened gradually along the way it didn't wait to be completely complete before they started using it. And so as it was being opened, what was happening was that all of the fulling mills were going out of business along the canal route. And fulling mills were places that you would take that women who were spinning their woolens, their homespun woolen cloths to be pulled, which is basically hammered with, you got this water mill with a trip hammer that just hammers the hell out of the fabric and kind of felts it. It's not like needle felting, but it's like pressure felting, and so that makes it more durable and waterproof. And all of that goes out of business immediately upon the canal making European textiles, British textiles available to these women, right? Who are in charge of producing this fabric for their families. And they all stop doing that, and they all start doing other things like milking cows and churning some extra butter for pin money or whatever, or gardening for the market, or all these other activities that they now all of a sudden have time to do, since they don't have to spend an extra 30 hours a week.
If you fast forward to today, a piece of that we're still seeing, because in the last week and a half, Joann's Fabrics, which is a large craft and fabric store in the United States, has gone bankrupt, and they expect they'll close in the next 2 months.
Oh, that's too bad.
But it's coming out of the pandemic. Fewer people are at home sewing their own things or buying things or making home crafts, literally to the point that the store can't support itself, and so they go bankrupt.
Oh, that's too bad. That means we're all going to be driven to the Right to Life fabric store.
Yeah, the Hobby Lobby.
Yeah.
Well,
Which is
the odd one balancing on there. There is nobody going.
Which is already encroaching into my area of Southern California.
So balancing on that, but with nobody going actually bust, as far as I can tell. If I spit 30 degrees to the left, I could go shop in American Gap or American Eagle or whatever the other one is that is a bit further away, or spit that way, I could dress local. But my nice Palestinian style red and white or black and white kachifah, the highest quality ones, and the ones that the local really like, are all manufactured in the UK. Why the UK makes 4-foot squares of thin cotton in a certain pattern, I don't know, but we do. I didn't know. I went up when I first wore my first one. I went all the way to Jordan to go get it. So maybe that's a newer factory thing. Or maybe it was all the exodus of the Palestinians and Jordanians going to the UK that brought the business with them. I don't know.
Yeah.
And there's on the way out, my normal way out tonight, there is one of several abaya shops where you've got 800 or 900 buyers hanging for being chosen and fitted if they want to refit or make to measure that style. And yeah, 90% of them are black. Not all of them are black. But you could still do a whole fashion show just on a black and white. And still get a show out. You know, like a couple of hours long, but still get a show.
Mm-hmm.
And here, clearly, here, it's just, you know, we made macaroni, we made camel milk chocolate, and several other bits and pieces. But otherwise, everything comes in. And you've got to, it's quite odd when you see people from not here. They're coming from elsewhere. I mean, there's a couple of Indians that I can see where the women are in saris as opposed to Western dress. And you get the odd Western woman wearing a sari, but about the only time they do that is when they're going to an Indian wedding. They didn't do it, go out shopping. And there is that, there's a level of the loss of locality. And I was wondering where you were going to end up in that segment there in terms of, I've got homespun, I've got European clothes, I've got American commercially manufactured. And a friend of mine's biggest claim to fame for the start of this year was they finally got around to finishing the fabric that they were collecting from plants out of hedgerow. So he's actually now got his first full homemade from scratch out of stinging nettle. So he's literally made the fibre that's in the stinging nettle, which is a bit like hemp. In the sense you get a flax type fibre.
Mm-hmm.
So he spun the thread, woven it into a fabric, and then had somebody make a shirt out of it. I'm not quite sure where he sourced the various dyes for it, but it's all natural colour dye. And so when's that all going to come back into much more theory? Clearly, we can do it, but we go back to some of, you know, even in debts, there was talk about what's being used as currency. And indigo, from memory, is one of the things at one point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then one of the things we haven't touched on, which is when indigo finally gets to Japan, all of a sudden, an awful lot of the artwork is a sort of like blue bias. It's almost like they've got on what the Dutch blue pattern crockery as opposed to
yeah.
And so there's all those things that swirl around, come around, and walk around, and it's like it's when I first came out of the Middle East. Of course, there was no mobile phones, so people walked around with their worry beads and or their French-style pochette, for instance, was quite common. Now people walk around with 2 or 3 phones because that's what we all do.
Mm-hmm.
And yet none of that is local driven. It's all, that's what's available. That's the best that's the best we can do. What we want to do. This is what advertising does to us. Industrialization, globalization. And it's like 9/10 of the food court here is non-Middle Eastern food.
Mm-hmm.
I get local Arab, Syrian, Lebanese, Turkish, Iranian, and then McDonald's, Burger King, KFC, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. I just put a link in since you mentioned Indigo. I mentioned this woman last week, Eliza Lucas. I didn't mention her by name, but she was Charles Pinckney's wife. He was the Chief Justice of South Carolina. But as a young girl, she came from the Caribbean and and settled in South Carolina, and she is the person who's credited with bringing indigo. And so that is a primary source that I made my students read.
But there's a lot of it in that context. But I think your in-depthing on peppermint shows up quite well. How individuals or families or what then become full and open corporates build up an expertise, keep it within the group, whatever the group happens to be, and then move it around, expand it, and take it to new markets.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that is, and there are kind of class elements to that as well. If they're, depending on whether they're sort of craftsman, artisan, techniques and traditions, or more sort of scientific, medical, medical traditions. In peppermint, there's both of those things, right? The doctors are interested in peppermint, and they're sort of academics who are theoretically trained in this tradition that that kind of begins its life in Edinburgh.
Obviously, here with the general premise of the book is social class. And it struck me that there is there's a dramatization of a book by Philippa that is where the expects to very high because that's where her social standing is. Her parents die for some reason, and then she therefore lives as a governess for her uncle's kids. But eventually she gets pushed out because the kids grow up and live there. And so she marries down. She marries down a long way to a sea merchant trader wants to marry up. So they sort of meet in the middle to some extent. He helps her with his streetwise training stuff, and she helps him with the etiquette and all the rest of it, and gets him money because she knows how to talk to bankers and people with money and investors and all the rest of it. And I thought, well, that's quite a classy high type story that needs to be extended a bit.
Well, and so many of those things have a kind of a class element to them that would have enriched this. This idea of who are these people? What are they coming for? What type of special knowledge are they coming with? She does mention a couple of times, Isenberg does, this idea that that the Palatine Germans are better workers and are sort of generally accepted as being more more sober and industrious and just would be great. Wouldn't it be just great to have a frontier that
and of course
with them?
With your Mrs. Trollope's domestic manners of Americans thing, we've got to get the West Wing quote in where Bartlett's talking to Charlie and he's reading a book. Turns out to be George Washington's book on manners and etiquette, of which the title of which I can't quite remember exactly. But it's full of do not put your hands on your body that would not otherwise be covered, except for Westlake. And he's lying on the sofa in the Oval Office reading it aloud, when Charlie walks in. Um, and then, of course, the follow-up line is because Leo walks around the corners. Yeah, but I could have whipped his ass. And that brings me back to the Lord John Marbury stuff is with Leo with a big bit of whip ass in Saratoga. I just to all my American friends, I just say 1812 is not just a very nice piece of music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, 1812, I mean, they 1812 is kind of the forgotten war. Well, I suppose the invasion of Mexico is the forgotten war, but 1812 is a forgotten war in American history. And it really does. I mean, we don't understand why would the British want to burn Washington? Um, didn't
Why would you go north of the border?
right. Well, why would we? Yeah, why would we burn York? Yeah, or Toronto, rather. Same town. Um, and yeah, and that whole idea I mean, but the sense at the time apparently was, and this is where historians need to do some work to try to discern whether this is just bullshit or reality, right? Whether this is just, rhetoric and justification, or whether this is a real reason that actually motivated people, these poor, benighted slaves of the British monarchy, who remain in British Canada, in the British possessions. We have to liberate them. We have to, drag them kicking and screaming to our enlightened way of living down here in the US.
So what you're telling me is you want me to come and get you when your democracy collapses come November.
Well, I'm not going back to the Middle East, but I'll go to England or Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there was a meme that went round where, which I think was before, but became quite prevalent with Trump's original campaign, was that Elizabeth was quite happy to re-execute treasonous,
Right.
tax dodging bastards back if you just want to revoke your election result.
Right. Well, I kind of like what said
gone.
about her and Colonel Sanders and the Vatican. And so I married an
So
ex.
Charlie's got an unfortunate name there in that sense, because we've got rid of both the Charlies one way or another.
Yep.
Prior to this, so it's a bad choice of a name, really.
It was kind of
I was shocked he
yeah.
stuck with that name.
Yeah. Well, how did Charles II die? I mean, he died on the throne. I mean, they didn't really get rid of him. They got rid of James.
Yeah, but glorious revolution. Yeah. So.
Yeah, but he was out of the picture by then. Yeah.
Yeah. Only just.
Yeah. And that was James the Papist they had to get rid of.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, but, so I'm a bit surprised that I mean, I at the moment, of course, I'm sitting in an absolute monarchy that is effectively a dictatorship. So what do I care?
Right. Well, it's
but it don't half get things done sometimes. And the last time I mentioned that to somebody else in a similar vein, it was when we were talking about how fast. We were talking a bit about transport, and obviously transport. The reason why Bonneville is where Bonneville is it's a crossover between the canal and the train. So that the milk came by train, cocoa by boat. was
English
just how
canal
far.
system is just amazing. It just blows my mind. I mean,
Um,
especially the way they use it in Peaky Blinders too. Fabulous.
yeah, the it was the way where and how fast the Chinese high speed rail network has grown.
Hmm.
And then somebody had the idea that let's overlay that, change the scale a bit, overlay it on the 48 continuous states and see what it looks like. And it pretty well fits, you
Hmm.
know.
Yeah.
Um, and
Well,
then,
and that transition from canals, I mean, it was very rapid, right? We had canals really exploded after 1825 when the Erie Canal opened, but by 1830, Peter Cooper was demoing Tom Thumb for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and which actually already had tracks. They were already kind of penetrating the Allegheny Mountains, to the west, um, with tracks, and they were, and the cars were basically just a string of Concord coaches that were pulled by horses. So, and in between that, right, you've got the Clermont in 1807, Fulton's boat on the Hudson River, and then you've got the what's the one on the Mississippi? The one that he's got one from Pittsburgh, that went all the way to New Orleans, and sort of in 1811. So by then, now all of a sudden you've got not only canals, which are very slow. I mean, it's just it's a usually donkeys, mules pulling canal boats. So it's very slow, but it's much more comfortable for people than and the cost per ton is so much lower to move freight. And then very rapidly you get this ability to go upriver as well as downriver, right? Because the big breakthrough for the Clermont was it made it to up the Hudson River to Albany in whatever it was, 32 hours. So the what is this? William Smith and the Birth of Modern Geology. Oh, cool. Um, I didn't. Yeah, that's an interesting connection. I hadn't really kind of made that connection. So English,
well,
yeah,
lots of digging. So
yeah. So they dug things up. Yeah,
yeah,
And well,
but
it also
not
happened
just.
that the British countryside went through several gradations of geological history. So as they're digging canals in one part of the country versus another, they're seeing dramatically different
different things.
strata.
Yeah, yeah.
And,
Interesting.
and then of course you get the railways that then say we don't do locks to go up and down hills, so we go
Yes.
through the hill,
Right.
or in some instances they did cut down
Right.
but never covered up. But you get all the where you've got good stone, you get tunnels, like
Right. Well, and then all
right.
of it, yeah. So then all of a sudden you can go anywhere, right? You're not limited by where, naturally occurring rivers happen to run, or where where there's enough level ground, like west into New York. There are a lot of locks on the Hudson River, but it could be worse. Um, but yeah, that whole era. It's actually I just one of the other books I got on my pile of interlibrary loans I just received
But
this week was a book about
with the
Peter Cooper.
dates,
He's an
with
interesting
the
character.
dates,
So
with the dates that you're talking about, of course, the other thing is the Napoleonic Wars come up to being finished.
mhm.
That releases an awful lot of manpower, and needs some place to put all the money that was being put into armaments, which no longer or drop off. But you've got all those discharged soldier, naval, etc. Um, and that's a big problem for Wellington with his prime minister.
Well, and the discharge of all these the this kind of adds to the mobility, doesn't it? I mean, this whole I mean, you get the Peterloo massacre in 1819. And that's probably the result of these demobilized soldiers who are, running around the countryside, wondering why they don't have enough to eat.
But there's just two elements there, of course, is that we want the social change, the unions are getting more clear, etc., etc. And then, of course, because in the UK, you just need the Riot Act needs to be read, but there's no real true police force back then. And you're supposed to do what the magistrate says. And in the Peterloo incidents, of course, he mumbles it in a corner, and the 10, 15,000 people don't hear it. And then the militia that is formal, but not as well trained as they should be, just go charging in. And so you get a 7th Cavalry to an Indian village type stupidity. Right. But that said, I in terms of the actual numbers of direct deaths was still relatively low, and I put that down to the bad training again, really. But
yeah, right. But even so, I mean,
and then of course they went after all the wounded to try and find them where they got this sort
shock. It's a shock to the system
doctors,
when Richard Carlisle, gets the word back to London.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is the beginning. I mean, really, really kind of is the beginning of a new era for that whole radical resistance movement, because they had sort of died back after the United Irishmen and the Gordon riots and all of that. It seemed like there was a quiet period in between there.
One of the things that I've realized too that she doesn't cover, that's kind of interesting for present day America, is how these people in the countryside who aren't farming and are presumably idle are actually eating and living and coming to terms. And there is, we have this national mythology about guns being handed down from father to son all the way down. So presumably they're hunting, and that's at least some of the hunting and foraging. And if I recall, Remington Arms was founded in 1816, just after our pivotal 1812 year. And they start making rifles and shotguns in upstate New York that then are shipped down, presumably to the South, that become part of this, frontier wilderness expansion story, which is a big piece of not only class, but class identity of how do we get that coonskin hat? Well, we got to go out and we got to hunt or trap that coonskin,
right,
to be able to do that. And some of that piece, I think, is sadly missing from at least some of this early story, which I think could be, or at least the reason I'm reading this book to inform, seeing that piece played into there, but particularly in this time period.
Yeah, no, I think that's really relevant. I mean, you get it's kind of weird. My family has been they usually have something running, and they've gone away this weekend to my in-laws' house, but usually they've got something going in the in the living room on the TV. And lately it's been the Waltons on Amazon Freevee. So with commercials every once in a while, but and the Waltons are always going up Walton Mountain with the rifle or the shotguns, and and taking down a turkey for grandpa's birthday or whatever. And that was I think that was a big part of and up here where I live, I mean, there's plenty of foraging, ice fishing, deer hunting. There's plenty of lockers, that stay in business. There's actually there's a fish locker right down the road from me that does enough business year round that they've managed to kind of, I think they rent snowmobiles and things in the winter, but they're still in business, just processing, people's catches. Red Lake walleye or whatever. Um, so there's still a lot of that goes on. People do kind of feed themselves. People raise all kinds of people raise, a few dozen head of cattle and, sell half, I buy a half a cow one, every year and, it comes from this guy and this, who runs this locker, who does, venison and private meat packing. So that's a whole
Yeah.
thing. And I wonder, where does it find any type of a place in kind of the national consciousness? I mean, every once in a while you'll hear, somebody like, somebody who's in the mainstream discourse, like Joel Salatin, who's the natural ag guy in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, right? And he'll often talk about pasture raised, beef and things like that. So he's kind of adjacent to that, but this idea of kind of local. I mean, years ago there was a debate when I was just starting to write about environmental history. I remember there was this debate going on about sort of organic versus food miles, which was the thing that you should really worry about. Should you hold out for the most organic, because there's plenty of, organic chips made in California that there's a lot of carbon expended getting them to me in Minnesota, right? As opposed to, Old Dutch, which might not be organic, but it's next door. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting how that whole thing. I mean, it's an issue that I've had, sort of for years with Tesla, right? The whole Tesla thing is it's an urban product, right? It's not. I mean, I had one and it was just on the edge of possible to kind of, operate that and go the places I needed to go and stuff. But they're not even thinking really about markets outside of
Yeah.
urban. And and obviously that's where all the nails are. So that's where their
It,
hammer's going to be
it,
aimed.
it took Remington Arms from 1816 to 1997, I think, is when they opened a plant in Paducah, Kentucky, um, to move their gun operation, any of their gun operations, out of the state of New York. And they went to Kentucky both because it was a non-union state, so for part of it was for labor costs.
Hmm.
But the bigger thing they were after was proximity to central shipping for Walmart's
Ah,
uh,
sure. Hmm.
shipping central setup in Arkansas. So, and most people don't realize, Walmart is the largest gun sales outfit
Sure.
in the
Hmm.
country.
Yep.
Most of them don't carry ammunition anymore, but it
Yep.
they weren't moving to the South because of a gun culture in the South that had to do more with labor costs and distribution
Hmm.
and proximity to Walmart
Yeah.
than it did to that bit of gun culture.
Yep.
And of course now they're bankrupt and having all kinds of problems.
Yeah. In 1888, the Remington family sold the company to Marcellus Hartley, who also owned the Union Metallic Cartridge Company and Winchester. Um, that's interesting.
I can it
And during the and during the Depression, they were acquired by DuPont.
yeah, it bears saying too that Remington is the oldest manufacturing concern in the United States. They were one of the earliest like factory setups
In
and longest
1816, yeah, that,
running.
that would make sense. Sure. 1816 I mean, they must have been among the very first people to take advantage of interchangeable parts. The whole Eli Whitney
Although
innovation.
even at that, a lot of their stuff was they were custom making barrels to go with stocks and other pieces. So a lot of it was custom made, even though interchangeable parts was a
Mm.
thing or slowly becoming a thing. They did a lot of, even into the early 2000s, they were doing a lot of custom boring on some of their, especially high end shotguns that they just weren't, they were mass manufacturing portions, but not all portions.
Hmm. Typewriters, that's an interesting question. The typewriter situation seems to have been, um, yeah, he sold, Remington's company bought into the typewriter business in 1873 for $12,000. When they bought the business from a guy by the name of Christopher Latham Scholes, who was a Wisconsin newspaper man and the inventor of the QWERTY um, typewriter, which he developed in Milwaukee and patented in 1868, along with Carlos Glidden and Samuel Soule. That's in
Yeah,
my,
and
I was just looking in my Obsidian vault. That's in there.
they also were very closely tied into Remington Rand, which also manufactured, amongst other things, card cabinets, index cards, card catalogs,
Probably
all of
teletypes.
it,
Yeah. Yep.
all of those things.
Hmm. Yep. Yep. I remember my first programming was on a teletype. It was a yellow paper tape machine, but
So I'll do it for Dan so he doesn't have to rewatch the video. But you were reading, so you missed
oh, nice.
my Remington Streamliner,
Cool.
and it's too heavy. But I've got a quiet rider in the other room that's probably about 20 pounds.
Oh, nice. Nice. So for next week, we should decide how far we're going. Let me look at so part two, the degeneration of the American breed. Chapter 6, pedigree clay eaters. Oh, that'll be fun. Chapter 7, mudsills, the Civil War. Chapter 8, eugenics. Maybe we should do that. Maybe we should do those three chapters because that will bring us up to the Civil War and then we can do not the Civil War. I'm sorry, it'll bring us up to the Gilded Age, and then we can do the Great Depression and what follows it. That sound good? That's about it's not a lot of reading. I mean, we could.
Yeah. Yeah, if we're going to split it up by page numbers, we could probably do all of that section and then all of part 3 to finish it out. It's about 100 chunks of 100 pages, roughly.
All right. Okay, let's do all of part 2. Yeah, because then we got the rise. Yeah, then in chapter 10, it looks like we got the rise of the South again. So, yeah, the South will rise again.
Lost cause, baby, lost cause.
Okay.
Well,
If you're going to have a cause, it might as well be a lost cause, right?
I was kind of shocked too at the tail end of chapter 5. She mentions, she mentions in politicking and Andrew Jackson's kind of being the first bibliographical sketch president to pop up, which
Mm.
kind of goes back to, I think Mark made mention of the um, kind of that idea of how do you create an identity as a president and run. And it took him 3 presidential election cycles to get into office,
Mm-hmm.
um, to create that narrative. But she ends the chapter mentioning you got to pick up the guy's fiddle and play a song he recognizes. And
Yeah.
I very specifically then searched immediately for William Jefferson Clinton, Southerner playing the saxophone on late night,
Yeah.
which she mentions, but she does not mention in the sense of, hey, you got to go play their music.
Mm-hmm.
Although if I remember, I think it was an Elvis song he played, wasn't it?
Yeah, Heartbreak Hotel, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
So not only is he playing an instrument and being kind of a man of the people, which was a huge piece of his campaign.
Sure. But he was also playing, he's playing a white appropriator's song. Cultural
And
appropriation.
I think he even went so far as to have an Elvis impersonator at his inaugural.
Wow.
Um,
Bubba. Yeah. But he was, but Toni Morrison said he was our first black president. I'm sure we'll get to him later in the book. I got to imagine he's going to be
I
present, at
One
least in
other thing
spirit.
that struck me too, that I'm kind of looking for more examples as we go on. But she does mention one or two times where people in power describe the crackers and the waste people as even worse or lower than the indigenous people who were already here and
Hmm.
or slaves,
Hmm.
which had to have been just a scorching indictment. But
Yeah.
she doesn't really play that up
Hmm.
in the way that it probably would have played then versus
Yes.
how that may play now.
If they,
Um,
yeah, if the regular people overheard the folks in the chambers of Congress or wherever they were saying it, yeah, saying those words, you would have think there would have been some reaction.
yeah, but she mentioned it's more like she mentions it in passing, and I
Yeah.
would have thought in a piece like this that would have made a big play,
Yeah.
and probably make an even bigger play as we go forward into this next section. So,
Yeah. Well, maybe some of that stuff will come next section. So it looks like people are dropping off, so we got to go.
all right,
There goes Mark.
good
See you
Saturday.
later, Pat. Thanks, Chris.